The sun scorched the earth until it cracked like old leather, each fissure a silent scream under her boots. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, stinging her eyes as she staggered across the plain. Her lips were chapped, split raw by the heat, and the canteen slung across her chest slapped empty against her ribs. Clara's shadow stretched long and thin before her, a ghost that offered no comfort. She'd been walking since dawn, maybe longer, time blurred in the haze of hunger and thirst. The horizon shimmered, mocking her with promises of water that never came. Somewhere behind her, the wagon's tracks had faded into the dirt, along with the men who'd left her there. No words, no reasons, just the creak of wheels and the backs of their hats as they vanished into the dust. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on a jagged rock, its heat searing her palm. Blood trickled from a cut she didn't feel. The wind carried no birdsong, only the low moan of a world too vast to care. She thought of her sister's voice, soft and pleading, back in Missouri, Clara, don't go. They'll eat you alive out there, but staying meant another kind of death, one slower and quieter, in a house that smelled of damp wood and regret. So she'd boarded the train with a letter in her pocket, promising work at a ranch in Wyoming. A new start. A fool's hope. Now, her breath rasped like sandpaper in her throat. She sank to the ground, the earth burning through her skirt. The letter was gone, lost somewhere in the miles she'd walked. It didn't matter. The name on it, J. Harrow, had led her to a derelict outpost, shutters banging in the wind, no one there to meet her. She'd waited until the stars came out, cold and sharp, before accepting the truth, no one was coming. Her eyes caught a glint in the distance, something metal, flashing under the sun. A trick of the light, maybe. Or hooves. She squinted, her vision swimming, and saw a shape moving toward her. A horse, black as coal, its rider a silhouette against the blazing sky. Clara's hand tightened around the rock, her heart thudding despite the exhaustion. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell. Out here, the line between the two was thin as a blade. The rider slowed, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust that settled like ash. A man dismounted, his boots crunching as he approached. He was tall, his face half hidden by a hat's shadow, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through the haze. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. He didn't offer a hand, just stood there, watching her as if she were a wounded animal that might still bite. Clara tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She coughed, tasting blood and dust. The man crouched, his coat brushing the ground, and held out a canteen. She stared at it, wary, her fingers twitching. "Take it," he said, not unkindly. "Ain't poison." She grabbed it, her hands trembling, and drank until water spilled down her chin. It tasted of metal and salvation. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. Instead, he pointed to the horse. "Can you stand?" She nodded, though her legs shook as she rose. The world tilted, but his hand caught her elbow, steady and rough. "Name's Eli," he said, almost an afterthought. "Harrow's expecting you." Her stomach twisted. Harrow. The name from the letter. The ranch. She'd thought it a lie, a cruel jest. But Eli's face held no mockery, only a kind of tired resolve. He helped her onto the horse, her body aching as she gripped the saddle. The beast snorted, restless, and she felt its heat beneath her, alive in a way the land was not. They rode in silence, the plain stretching endless around them. Clara's mind drifted, snagging on memories she'd tried to bury. Her father's hands, calloused and heavy, signing her away to a stranger's promise. Her sister's tears, glinting in the lamplight. The train's whistle, sharp as a goodbye. She didn't notice the ranch until it loomed before them, a sprawl of weathered wood and barbed wire, crouched under a sky bruised with dusk. Figures moved in the distance, their shouts carried on the wind. Harrow's ranch. The place all feared. Eli reined in the horse, his eyes on her. "You sure about this?" he asked, as if she had a choice. She nodded, her jaw tight. The wind howled, carrying the scent of smoke and leather. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. The ranch house squatted low, its timbers warped by years of wind and sun, the porch sagging like an old man's shoulders. Lanterns hung from rusted nails, casting pools of yellow light that flickered against the gathering dark. Clara slid from the horse, her legs nearly giving way as her boots hit the dirt. Eli steadied her again, his grip firm but fleeting, as if he didn't trust himself to linger. The air smelled of hay and sweat, undercut by something sharper, blood, maybe, or the tang of iron from the corrals. Shouts and the clatter of hooves echoed from the barns, where shadows moved like ghosts in the dusk. Clara's eyes darted to the house. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and lean, his silhouette framed by the glow within. Harrow. She knew it without being told. His presence seemed to pull the air taut, like a rope stretched to breaking. He stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding soft and deliberate. "You're late," he said, his voice a low drawl, not angry but heavy with expectation. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a jaw like a blade, eyes that caught the lantern light and held it. Clara straightened, though her body ached. "Didn't know I was expected," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Harrow's gaze flicked over her, taking in the torn hem of her skirt, the dust caked on her hands. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression, curiosity, maybe, or recognition of something broken but not yet gone. "Eli says you're the one from the letter," Harrow said, stepping closer. His coat was worn, patched at the elbows, but his hands were clean, deliberate. "You know what we do here?" She shook her head, her throat tight. The letter had promised work, cooking, cleaning, maybe tending livestock. But the weight in Harrow's voice, the way the ranch hands watched from the shadows, told her it was more than that. "We break what's wild," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Horses. Men. Sometimes the land itself. You'll do the same, or you'll leave." Her mind flashed to the wagon, the men who'd abandoned her without a glance. The memory burned, sharp as a knife. She'd been broken before, by hunger, by betrayal, by a father who saw her as a debt to be paid. But she was still here, standing, her hands curled into fists. "I'll stay," she said, the words tasting of dust and defiance. Harrow nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Rooms in the bunkhouse. You start at dawn." He turned back to the house, the conversation over. Eli lingered, his face unreadable, then tipped his hat and led the horse away. Clara stood alone, the night pressing in, the stars above cold and distant. The bunkhouse was a low, weathered building across the yard, its door creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of straw and tobacco, the air thick with the ghosts of those who'd slept there before. She sank onto a cot, her body heavy, her mind tangled with images. Her sister's face, pale and pleading, flickered in the dark. "Clara, you'll die out there," the words echoed, but they felt distant now, drowned by the creak of the bunkhouse and the low moan of the wind outside. She thought of her mother, too, her hands kneading dough, her voice singing hymns until sickness stole her breath. Clara had buried her alone, the ground hard and unyielding, her father already gone to drink and debts. That was the weight she carried, a life of leaving, of being left. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of the ranch, horses stamping, men cursing, the crack of a whip somewhere in the distance. When dawn broke, it was a thin, gray light, seeping through the bunkhouse window like water through a cracked dam. Clara rose, her muscles stiff, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting her skin, but it woke her senses. The ranch was already alive. Hands driving cattle, the clang of metal on metal, the scent of burning wood. She saw Eli near the corral, his hat low, his hands busy with a rope. He glanced at her, a flicker of something like concern in his eyes, but he said nothing. Harrow appeared from the barn, his coat dusted with hay. "You'll start in the kitchen," he said, pointing to the main house. "Food keeps this place alive. Don't let it run dry." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a challenge in it, a test. Clara nodded, her jaw tight, and walked toward the house. The wind tugged at her skirt, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. Somewhere, a horse screamed, wild and unbroken. The kitchen smelled of grease and ash, the air thick with the ghost of burned bread. Clara stood at the scarred wooden table, her hands dusted with flour, kneading dough that clung to her fingers like damp earth. The stove glowed red, its heat pressing against her skin, and the window above the sink framed a view of the corral. Men shouting, horses rearing, dust rising like a storm. Her arms ached from hours of work, scrubbing pots, slicing onions that stung her eyes, hauling water from a pump that groaned with every pull. The ranch hands ate like wolves, their plates piled high, their voices rough as they called for more. She moved through the tasks in silence, her body a machine, her mind a tangle of memory and hunger. She thought of her mother's kitchen, the way sunlight had spilled through the window, catching the dust motes as they danced. Her mother's hands had been gentle, shaping loaves with a rhythm Clara could still feel in her bones. "You've got strong hands, girl," she'd said once, her voice soft as a hymn. But that was before the fever, before the grave, before Clara learned that strong hands could still break. She pushed the thought away, pressing the dough harder, her knuckles whitening against the wood. A shadow fell across the table. Harrow stood in the doorway, his hat tilted back, his eyes scanning the room as if measuring her against it. "Food's good," he said, his tone flat but not unkind. "They're eating. That's what matters." He stepped closer, his boots leaving faint tracks of dirt on the floor. "You ever worked a place like this?" Clara shook her head, her hands still moving. "Just my own house," she said, her voice low. "Kept it fed." She didn't mention the rest. How she'd cooked for a father who never thanked her, how she'd stretched scraps to feed her sister, how the pantry had grown emptier each year until there was nothing left but dust and promises. Harrow nodded, his gaze lingering on her hands. "This ain't a house," he said. "It's a machine. Breaks everything that don't fit. You keep up, or it'll spit you out." He turned to leave, then paused. "Eli says you walked half the plane to get here. That true?" She met his eyes, her chin lifting slightly. "Didn't have a choice." Something flickered in his face, not pity, but a kind of respect, sharp and fleeting. "You do now," he said, and was gone. The day bled into dusk, the sky turning the color of bruised plums. Clara stepped outside, her apron heavy with flour and grease, and leaned against the porch rail. The ranch was quieter now, the men scattered, their voices swallowed by the wind. She saw Eli across the yard, leading a horse to the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced her way, and for a moment, their eyes held, his steady, hers searching. Then he turned back to the horse, and the moment broke like a snapped twig. That night, she lay on her cot, the bunkhouse creaking around her. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind drifted to the letter, its ink smudged by her own sweat. Asterisk work at Harrow's ranch. Good pay. Hard labor, asterisk she'd thought it a lifeline, a way to escape the weight of her past. But this place was no salvation. It was raw, unyielding, a world of sharp edges and sharper men. Yet there was something in it, something in the way the land stretched endless under the stars, in the way Eli's hands moved with quiet care, in the way Harrow's words carried both threat and promise. It stirred something in her, a flicker of fire she thought had gone out. The next morning, she woke to a scream, not human, but wild, piercing the dawn. She stumbled outside, her breath catching as she saw it, a horse, black as midnight, rearing in the corral, its eyes rolling with fear. Men circled it, ropes taut, their shouts swallowed by the animal's fury. Eli was there, his face grim, a rope in one hand, a whip in the other. He didn't use it, though, just held it, like a warning. Clara watched, her heart pounding, as the horse kicked and thrashed, its hooves carving arcs in the dust. "Wild one," a voice said beside her. She turned to see a young hand, his face weathered beyond his years. "Harrow's specialty. Breaks, or berries, M." He spat into the dirt and walked away. Clara's eyes stayed on the horse, its muscles straining, its breath steaming in the cold air. She thought of herself, staggering across the plain, abandoned, unbroken. The wind rose, carrying the scent of sweat and sage, and she felt it again, that flicker, growing brighter. The corral was a chaos of dust and rope, the black horse a storm at its center. Clara stood frozen, her breath shallow, as the animal reared again, its hooves slicing the air. The men shouted, their voices sharp with frustration, but Eli moved differently, calm, almost gentle, his eyes locked on the horse as if he could see its fear. He dropped the whip, letting it fall to the dirt, and raised a hand, palm out, like a man offering peace to a wildfire. The horse snorted, its ears twitching, but it didn't charge. Clara's chest tightened, her hands clenching at her sides. She knew that kind of fear, the kind that made you lash out because surrender felt like death. She turned away, her boots scuffing the dirt, and headed back to the kitchen. The work was relentless, pots to scrub, bread to bake, meat to sear until the air was thick with grease. But her mind kept drifting to the corral, to the horse's wild eyes, to Eli's quiet patience. She thought of her own arrival, half dead on the plain, and how Eli hadn't asked questions, hadn't judged. Just handed her water and brought her here. To this place. To Harrow. By noon, the kitchen was a furnace, her hair plastered to her neck with sweat. She stepped outside for air, the wind cool against her flushed skin. The corral was empty now, the horse gone, the men scattered. She saw Harrow near the barn, his hat low, talking to a hand who gestured wildly. His eyes flicked to her, brief but piercing, and she felt exposed, as if he could see the cracks in her resolve. She looked away, her gaze catching on a patch of sagebrush swaying in the distance, its green a rare softness against the brown earth. That evening, she found Eli at the edge of the ranch, near a dry creek bed where the wind carved patterns in the sand. He was whittling, his knife shaving curls of wood from a small stick, his movement steady as a heartbeat. She hesitated, then approached, her shadow falling across his hands. He didn't look up. "Horse settled," he said, as if she'd asked. "Took time, but she's in the barn." "Not broken, just listening." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. "Make something wild trust you?" He paused, his knife still, and looked at her. His eyes were gray, like storm clouds, and they held a weight she hadn't noticed before. "You don't," he said. "Not really. You just give it room to breathe. Let it choose." He went back to whittling, the wood curling like smoke under his blade. She stood there, the words sinking into her. Room to breathe. She hadn't had that in years, not since her mother's death, not since her father's debts, not since the wagon left her in the dust. She thought of the letter, its promise of work, and how it had led her to this ranch, this moment. She wanted to ask Eli more, to unravel the quiet strength in his voice, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat on a nearby rock, the stone cold against her thighs, and watched the sunset bleed red across the sky. That night, her dreams were jagged, her sister's face, her father's fists, the endless plain. She woke gasping, the bunkhouse dark and silent except for the creak of wood settling. She pulled her blanket tight, her heart pounding, and thought of Eli's words. Let it choose. She wasn't sure what her choice was yet, stay and fight the ranch's brutal rhythm, or walk away and face the plain again. Both felt like falling. The next day, Harrow called her to the barn. The air inside was thick with hay and manure, the light dim through slatted walls. He stood by a stall, the black horse inside, its flank twitching. "You'll help with her," he said, his voice sharp but not cruel. "Feed her, clean her stall. She's yours to tend." Clara's stomach knotted. "I don't know horses," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. "You'll learn," Harrow replied, his eyes unyielding. "Or you'll leave." He walked out, leaving her alone with the animal. The horse snorted, its eyes wild but weary, and Clara felt a pang of recognition. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out, not touching, just offering her presence. The horse stilled, its breath hot and heavy, and for a moment, the barn was quiet except for the wind outside, singing through the cracks. The barn was a cathedral of dust and shadow, its air heavy with the musk of hay and leather. Clara stood before the black horse, her hand still outstretched, her fingers trembling in the dim light. The animal's eyes glinted, wary but not wild, as if it were measuring her as much as she was measuring it. Her heart thudded, not from fear but from something deeper, a recognition of the creature's raw, unbroken spirit, like a mirror held to her own. She lowered her hand slowly, her breath catching as the horse snorted and tossed its head, hooves scuffing the straw-strewn floor. She began the work Harrow had set, hauling buckets of water, scooping grain, raking out the stall's damp straw. Her muscles burned, unused to the labor, but she moved with a quiet focus, her hands finding a rhythm that steadied her mind. The horse watched, its ears flicking at every sound, her footsteps, the creak of the bucket, the distant shout of a ranch hand. She didn't speak to it, not yet. Words felt too heavy, too human, for the space between them. Outside, the day was relentless, the sun a hammer on the earth. Clara paused at the barn door, wiping sweat from her brow, and saw Eli across the yard, repairing a fence with a hammer and wire. His shirt clung to his back, his movements deliberate, like a man who knew the cost of haste. He glanced her way, and she thought she saw a nod, faint but there, before he turned back to his work. The gesture warmed her, a small spark in the vastness of the ranch's indifference. Her thoughts drifted to Missouri, to the night she'd left. Her sister had stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clutching a shawl. "You're chasing a ghost, Clara," she'd whispered. "There's nothing out there but dust," Clara had wanted to argue, to say she was running toward something, not away. But the truth was, she didn't know. The letter had been her only map, its promise of work a faint hope against the weight of her father's debts, her mother's grave, the emptiness that followed. Now, here, the hope felt fragile, but it was hers. By dusk, the barn was cooler, the light softening to a golden haze. Clara returned to the horse, her hands steady as she offered a handful of grain. The animal hesitated, then lowered its head, lips brushing her palm. The touch was fleeting, warm, and it sent a shiver through her. She thought of Eli's words, give it room to breathe and felt a shift inside her, small but undeniable. She wasn't taming this horse, not yet. She was learning its language, and maybe her own. That night, Harrow called the hands to the main house for supper. Clara served the meal, thick stew, cornbread, coffee black as tar, her movements quick but careful. The men ate in near silence, their faces weathered, their eyes avoiding hers. Harrow sat at the head of the table, his presence a quiet command. He didn't speak to her, but his gaze lingered, assessing. She met it once, her chin lifting, and saw something in his eyes, not kindness, but a grudging respect, like he'd seen her outlast the day. After the meal, she stepped onto the porch, the air sharp with the scent of sage and cooling earth. The stars were out, bright and unyielding, and the ranch seemed to hold its breath. She thought of the horse, its tentative trust, and of Eli's steady hands. She thought of her sister, her mother, the plane that had nearly killed her. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, but it didn't crush her. Not tonight. She heard boots behind her and turned to see Eli, his hat in his hands, his face half-lit by the lantern's glow. "You're doing all right," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. "With the horse? With this place?" Clara looked at him, searching for mockery, but found none. "Don't feel like it," she admitted, her voice rough. "Feels like I'm just holding on." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "That's enough, for now." He didn't say more, just stood there, the silence between them soft as the night. She wanted to ask him why he stayed, what kept him tethered to this harsh place, but the question felt too big, too raw. Instead, she let the wind speak, its low moan weaving through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and possibility. The dawn broke cold, a thin frost glittering on the corral posts, the air sharp with the bite of early winter. Clara's breath clouded as she hauled water to the barn, her hands chapped and stinging from the pump's icy handle. The black horse, which she'd started calling Shadow for the way it moved like a flicker of darkness, snorted softly as she entered the stall. Its eyes were calmer now, though still wary, tracking her movements as she poured grain into the trough. She reached out, slow and deliberate, and brushed her fingers along its flank. The horse flinched but didn't pull away, its warmth seeping into her palm. For a moment, the barn was a world apart, just her and Shadow, two creatures learning to trust in a place that offered little mercy. Outside, the ranch hummed with its brutal rhythm, men cursing as they wrestled cattle, the crack of a whip, the groan of wood under strain. Clara's days had settled into a pattern: kitchen work at dawn, barn duties by noon, serving supper under Harrow's watchful eye. Her body adapted, growing stronger, though her mind still snagged on the past. She saw her sister's face in the steam rising from the stew, heard her father's slurred voice in the creak of the bunkhouse door. Each memory was a stone in her chest, heavy but familiar, and she carried them as she carried the buckets, the trays, the weight of Harrow's expectations. She was sweeping the porch when Eli approached, his boots crunching on the frost-dusted dirt. He carried a coil of rope, his hands raw from work, and his eyes held a question he didn't voice. "Harrow's watching you," he said, leaning against a post. "Says you've got grit. Not sure he likes it." His tone was light, but there was a warning in it, like a man pointing out a rattlesnake before it struck. Clara paused, her broom still. "He wants me gone?" she asked, her voice steady despite the twist in her gut. Eli shook his head. "He wants you useful. There's a difference." He glanced at the barn, where Shadow's silhouette moved in the dim light. "Keep with the horse. It's a start." He walked off, leaving her with the broom and the wind, which carried the faint scent of snow. That afternoon, Harrow called her to the corral. The air was thick with dust, the men gathered around a new horse, a bay stallion, its coat gleaming with sweat, its eyes wild with panic. Ropes bit into its hide, and a hand yanked hard, shouting curses. Harrow stood apart, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "You'll help break this one," he said to Clara, his voice cutting through the noise. "Shadow's too easy. This one's got fight." Her stomach dropped. She glanced at the stallion, its hooves churning the dirt, and saw her own fear reflected back, fear of failing, of breaking, of being cast out again. "I don't know how," she said, her hands clenching. "You'll learn," Harrow replied, his tone final. He nodded to Eli, who stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of reassurance. "Show her," Harrow said, and walked away. Eli handed her a rope, its weight heavy in her hands. "Don't pull," he said, his voice low. "Guide. Let him feel you're there, not fighting him." She nodded, her throat tight, and stepped into the corral. The stallion reared, its scream piercing, and Clara's heart pounded, but she held the rope, her feet planted in the dirt. Eli stayed close, his presence steady, like a rock in a river. The horse bucked, pulling against her, but she didn't yank back. She breathed, slow and deep, and felt the rope slacken, just a fraction. That night, she lay awake, her body aching, her mind replaying the corral, the stallion's fury, Eli's quiet guidance, Harrow's unyielding gaze. She thought of her mother, singing hymns as she worked, her voice a thread of light in a dark house. Clara had clung to that light once, but it was gone now, buried in Missouri's hard earth. Here, in this brutal place, she was finding something else, not light, but fire, small and stubborn, flickering in her chest. She rose before dawn, the sky still dark, and walked to the barn. Shadow stood in her stall, her breath steaming in the cold. Clara rested her forehead against the horse's neck, feeling its warmth, its pulse. The wind outside was silent, the ranch holding its breath. For the first time, Clara felt it too, a choice, not yet made, but close. To stay, to fight, to let the fire grow. The frost had thickened overnight, painting the ranch in a brittle sheen that cracked underfoot. Clara's breath hung in the air as she crossed the yard to the corral, the rope coiled in her hands like a lifeline. The bay stallion paced inside, its breath steaming, its eyes still wild but tempered by exhaustion. Eli was already there, leaning against the fence, his hat tipped low against the dawn's pale light. He nodded to her, a gesture so small it might have been missed, but it steadied her, like a hand on her shoulder. The wind was still, the air heavy with the promise of snow, and the ranch felt hushed, as if waiting for something to break. She stepped into the corral, her boots sinking into the churned dirt. The stallion snorted, its ears pinned, but Clara kept her movements slow, her hands loose on the rope. She remembered Eli's words, *guide, don't fight*, and let the rope slacken, giving the horse room to move. It circled her, hooves kicking up frost, and she felt the weight of the men's eyes on her, their silence louder than any shout. Harrow stood at the gate, his shadow long and sharp, watching without a word. Her mind flickered to the plain, to the moment she'd collapsed, her hands scraping the dirt, the buzzards circling above. She'd chosen to keep moving then, not because she believed in salvation, but because stopping meant giving up. Now, with the stallion's breath hot in the air, she felt that same choice pressing against her. Fight or fall. She tightened her grip on the rope, just enough to let the horse feel her presence, and it slowed, its head lowering, its eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. Not trust, not yet, but a pause. A breath. Eli stepped closer, his voice low. "You're getting it," he said, his words carrying a warmth that cut through the cold. "He's starting to hear you." She nodded, her throat tight, and felt the fire in her chest flicker brighter, its heat spreading to her hands, her heart. The day unfolded in a blur of work, kitchen, barn, corral, the rhythm of the ranch pulling her along like a current. She fed Shadow, her hands steady now, and the mare nudged her palm, a small gesture that felt like a gift. At supper, the hands ate in their usual silence, but one, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, muttered, "Good stew," before pushing his plate away. It was the closest thing to praise she'd heard, and it landed like a stone in still water, rippling through her. After the meal, she found Harrow on the porch, his eyes on the horizon where the sky was turning the color of ash. "You didn't run," he said, not looking at her. "Most would have, after a day like today." Clara stood beside him, her hands clasped to keep them still. "Didn't have anywhere to go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He turned then, his eyes sharp, searching. "You do now," he said, echoing his words from that first day. But this time, they felt different, not a challenge, but an acknowledgement. He walked back into the house, leaving her with the night and the faint howl of a coyote in the distance. She wandered to the creek bed, where the frost glittered like stars trapped in the earth. Eli was there, sitting on a rock, his knife carving slow curls from a piece of wood. She sat nearby, the cold biting through her skirt, and let the silence settle between them. It wasn't empty, this silence, it was full of the ranch's pulse, the wind's low song, the weight of choices made and unmade. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli's knife paused, his eyes on the wood. "Every day," he said. "But this place, it's got a hold. Not sure if it's good or bad, but it's real." He looked at her then, his face soft in the starlight. "You feel it too, don't you?" She nodded, her chest tight. She felt it, the ranch's brutal beauty, its demand for resilience, its quiet moments of grace. She thought of Shadow, of the stallion, of the way her hands had learned to move without fear. She thought of her sister, her mother, the plain, and how they'd shaped her, but not defined her. The fire in her was hers now, burning steady, no longer a flicker. The sky lightened, a faint glow on the horizon, and the air smelled of snow and sage. Clara stood, her boots crunching the frost, and looked out at the ranch, its shapes soft in the dawn. The wind stirred, gentle now, carrying the scent of dust and dreams. She was still here, unbroken, and the land seemed to whisper her name.